Hello and welcome. This video was created to help people relax or sleep. With this in mind, I only put 3 ads in the entire video, and the stories in this video are allegedly true and actually happened. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel and like the video. Lastly, thank you for being here when you have so many other choices. Now let's begin. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, sharp and sterile, as Emily's footsteps echoed down the deserted hallway. The hospital had always seemed different at night, as though it wore a shroud of secrets after the sun dipped below the horizon. Emily had worked as a night nurse for years, and while she was used to the quiet, there was something unsettling about the 4th floor of St. Mary's Hospital. She adjusted her badge, the lamplight catching the shine of her name, Emily Harper. At 32, she was known for her composure and reliability, someone who could handle long shifts and difficult patients without complaint. But tonight, she felt an unease she couldn't shake. It started with the assignment. "You'll be covering the old wing tonight," her supervisor, Linda, had said casually. Linda's eyes darted to the side as she handed over the keys. "We're short-staffed, and they've been needing some oversight there. Just routine checks. Don't worry, it's mostly storage and equipment now." Emily had nodded, though a slight prickle of apprehension crept up her spine. The old wing had been closed years ago, after a modernization project redirected resources to newer facilities. Rumors floated around, of course. Whispers about patients who'd died alone in its rooms, strange noises, and even ghostly sightings. But Emily brushed those off as the usual chatter that surrounded any hospital with a long history. Now, as she stepped onto the 4th floor, she couldn't ignore the oppressive silence that greeted her. The walls were painted in a dull, faded beige, their cracks like veins running through an aging body. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering every so often as though reluctant to stay awake. Emily glanced at her watch. It was just after midnight. She walked past the nurse's station, a dusty relic of the past, its counter cluttered with abandoned paperwork and faded coffee stains. A laminated floor plan caught her eye. Emily paused, leaning in to study it. The map outlined the various rooms, from patient wards to utility closets. At the bottom corner, a handwritten note was scrawled: "Don't go into room 426 after dark." Her breath hitched for a moment. Emily shook her head, dismissing the warning as some kind of inside joke. She folded the map into her pocket and continued down the hall. The first few rooms were unremarkable, filled with unused beds and outdated medical equipment. She checked them off her list mechanically, her flashlight sweeping over the dust-laden surfaces. But as she reached room 419, she hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. "Hello?" she called out, her voice firm but calm. There was no reply. Slowly, she pushed the door open, the hinges creaking like a groan of protest. The room was empty, save for a single wheelchair positioned in the center. Its wheels glinted under her flashlight beam, and for a moment, Emily could have sworn it had moved. She stepped closer, her shoes making soft squeaks against the floor. A faint breeze brushed past her, though the windows were sealed shut. Emily's heart began to pound, the silence around her growing heavier as though the air itself carried weight. "It's just an old building," she murmured to herself, her voice a fragile tether to normalcy. She quickly jotted down a note on her clipboard and turned to leave. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been imagined. "Help me." Emily froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. She spun around, her flashlight beam darting across the room. The wheelchair remained still, but the whisper seemed to linger, weaving itself into the stillness. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. The only response was the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system. Emily stepped back into the hallway, her skin crawling with unease. She glanced down the corridor, its length stretching endlessly before her. The air felt colder now, biting against her exposed skin. She tightened her grip on the flashlight and pressed on, determined to finish her rounds quickly. "I'm losing progress," she said. As she approached room 426, a sense of dread began to build in her chest. The door was closed, its surface marred with scratches that looked disturbingly fresh. A faint light seeped out from beneath it, flickering like the dying embers of a candle. Emily swallowed hard. "It's just an empty room," she told herself, but her hands trembled as she reached for the handle. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, a sharp, echoing clang reverberated down the hall behind her. She whipped around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sound had come from the nurse's station. Emily's breathing quickened as she retraced her steps, her shoes clicking against the tile floor. The station appeared just as she'd left it, except for one thing. The floor plan she'd pocketed earlier now lay spread open on the counter, its edges curling slightly as though touched by unseen hands. A single red circle had been drawn around room 426. Nick. Emily's stomach lurched. She backed away, her heart racing as the oppressive silence seemed to press in from all sides. She thought of calling for backup, but hesitated. What would she even say? That a piece of paper had moved on its own? The hallway stretched out before her like a gaping maw, and for the first time in her years as a nurse, Emily felt truly afraid. The elevator doors groaned open, and a stale draft greeted Dr. Evelyn Carter. She tightened her grip on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the oppressive darkness of the hospital's abandoned wing. As she stepped out, the air felt heavier, colder. Each breath was a whisper against the unnerving silence. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the peeling paint on the walls curling like ancient scrolls. Faint, disjointed whispers seemed to echo from somewhere far ahead. Evelyn paused, her pulse quickening. Were her ears playing tricks on her, or was someone, or something, in the wing with her? "Hello?" Her voice trembled, the sound swallowed by the emptiness. No answer. She forced herself forward, her footsteps muffled by layers of dust. The once sterile environment was now a decaying memory of its former self. Exam room doors lined the corridor, their windows smeared with grime. Some hung ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. Reaching the nurse's station, Evelyn found an old desk cluttered with yellowed papers and a broken rotary phone. A faded photograph caught her eye, a group of staff members smiling brightly. The faces seemed oddly familiar, though Evelyn couldn't place where she'd seen them before. She tucked the photo into her pocket and moved on. A sudden clang echoed behind her, sharp and jarring. She spun around, her flashlight beam darting over the walls. Nothing. Yet the sound had been real, metal striking metal. Her instincts screamed that she wasn't alone. Determined to push forward, she approached the operating theater at the end of the hall. The double doors stood slightly open, revealing a sliver of light that flickered unnaturally. Evelyn hesitated. The whispers grew louder now, weaving together like strands of a sinister melody. Steeling herself, she nudged the doors open. The flashlight illuminated the room, a grim tableau of rusting surgical tools scattered across tables, and an old operating table in the center, its leather straps frayed. The light she'd seen was coming from an old lamp, its flickering bulb struggling to stay alive. Evelyn's gaze fell on the walls. Words scrawled in crimson streaks covered them, some faded, others fresh. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Help me. It's watching. Don't trust the shadows." Her breath hitched as she read the final line. Evelyn Lee Happ. She staggered back, her flashlight trembling in her grasp. Who had written her name? And how did they know she'd come here? Before she could think further, a faint shuffling noise came from the corner of the room. Slowly, she turned the beam of light toward the sound. It landed on a wheelchair, its wheels caked with grime, sitting motionless. Then, it moved. Just an inch, but enough to send a chill down her spine. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The shadows seemed to ripple, coalescing into a darker form. Evelyn froze, unable to tear her eyes away as the silhouette took shape. Humanoid, but distorted, its limbs elongated unnaturally. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in the void. The whispers crescendoed into a cacophony, 1,000 voices speaking over one another. Evelyn stumbled back, her flashlight flickering erratically. She fumbled for the door, her hands slick with sweat, and bolted into the hallway. The whispers followed her, growing louder, closer. She ran, her breaths ragged, until she reached the elevator. Frantically pressing the button, she glanced over her shoulder. The shadow was there, at the end of the hallway, watching her with its ember eyes. The elevator doors creaked open, and Evelyn threw herself inside. She jabbed the button for the main floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. As the doors slid shut, the shadow surged forward, faster than she thought possible. For a moment, she thought it would reach her. But the doors closed just in time. The elevator jolted to life, descending slowly. Evelyn leaned against the wall, trembling. She glanced down at her flashlight, now dim and sputtering. When the elevator doors opened again, she stepped out into the safety of the hospital's brightly lit lobby. The hum of fluorescent lights was a welcome relief. But as she turned to look back at the elevator, her blood ran cold. One person was missing. She saw it on the camera line. The shadow's ember eyes were staring at her from the darkness within. Dr. Evelyn Carter stumbled into the brightly lit hospital lobby, her heart racing and breath shallow. The stark contrast of the light against the memory of the shadowed figure did little to calm her. Her hands still shook, and the flashlight dangled uselessly by her side, its beam reduced to a faint flicker. "Evelyn?" a voice called out. She whipped around to see Grace, one of the night shift nurses, standing behind the reception desk. The sight of another human being felt like a lifeline. Grace's brow furrowed as she took in Evelyn's pale face and trembling form. "What happened? Are you okay?" Grace asked, stepping around the desk. "Aren't you retired altogether?" Tom said with disfigurement and slowness as he crouched near the walkway. Evelyn began, her voice hoarse. I thought I saw something in the abandoned wing. Someone was there." "No, not someone. Something." Grace's expression shifted to one of concern, mixed with skepticism. "The abandoned wing? Evelyn, you know nobody's supposed to go in there. It's been closed for years." "I know," Evelyn said, clutching the photograph she'd taken from the nurse's station. "But there's something wrong. The shadow. It followed me. Before she could finish, the elevator dinged behind her. Evelyn turned sharply, her eyes fixed on the silver doors. Slowly they slid open, revealing an empty car. Her stomach tightened as she stared into the void, half expecting the glowing ember eyes to appear again. But they didn't. "Evelyn?" Grace's voice snapped her back to the moment. "Maybe you should sit down. You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Evelyn murmured, more to herself than to Grace. Hours passed, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She sat in the on-call room, the dim table lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The photograph from the abandoned wing lay on the desk before her. She stared at the smiling faces, her finger tracing over each one. Her eyes landed on the man in the center of the group, a doctor with a kind smile and piercing eyes. Something about him tugged at her memory. Evelyn pulled out her phone and began searching through the hospital's digital archives, hoping to find some mention of him or the other people in the photograph. After what felt like an eternity, she found it. An article dated 20 years ago, detailing an incident in the hospital's East Wing. Her heart sank as she read. Tragic accident claims lives of staff in hospital fire. The article named each victim, their smiling faces now frozen in the photograph before her. The kind-eyed doctor's name was Dr. Leonard Hale. According to the report, he'd been one of the last to leave the operating theater, trying to save a patient when the fire engulfed the wing. None of them had survived. A cold chill crept up Evelyn's spine. She glanced at the photograph again, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw the faintest shadow moving behind the group. She blinked, and it was gone. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's just the light." But the unease gnawed at her, and the whispers she'd heard earlier echoed faintly in her mind. Later that night, Evelyn found herself drawn back to the elevator. It was as if an unseen force was compelling her to return. She hesitated before pressing the button for the abandoned wing. The elevator hummed to life, carrying her upward. When the doors opened, the oppressive darkness greeted her once again. This time, she came prepared with a stronger flashlight and a determined resolve. She stepped out, her shoes crunching on the debris-strewn floor. The air was heavier than before, thick with an almost tangible tension. Evelyn made her way back to the operating theater, the whispers growing louder with each step. They were clearer now, distinct voices overlapping in a mournful chorus. She strained to make out the words. Humbly, they said, "Help us. He's here." Feeling, Eve Avalas. Her name sent a shiver down her spine. She pushed open the doors to the operating theater, the flickering lamp still casting its eerie glow. The words on the walls seemed brighter, as if freshly painted in crimson. "Who's here?" Evelyn demanded, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the room into silence. Then a single voice spoke, deep and resonant, reverberating through the room. "You should not have returned." Evelyn spun around, her flashlight beam darting across the room. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, coalescing into the form she'd seen before. The glowing ember eyes locked onto hers, and the oppressive weight of its gaze forced her to take a step back. "What do you want?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The shadow tilted its head, as if considering her question. When it spoke again, its voice was a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You." Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She stumbled back, her flashlight flickering wildly. The shadow advanced slowly, its elongated limbs stretching toward her. Desperation took over, and she turned to run, but the door slammed shut before she could reach it. "No!" she screamed, pounding on the door. "Let me out!" The whispers returned, louder and more frantic. Evelyn turned to face the shadow, her back pressed against the cold metal door. It loomed over her, its ember eyes burning brighter. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow froze. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. Evelyn's flashlight flickered one last time before plunging the room into complete darkness. "Athelane," the voice said, now soft and almost gentle. "The truth awaits." The door behind her creaked open, and a faint light spilled into the room. Without hesitation, Evelyn bolted into the hallway, not daring to look back. As she ran, a single thought burned in her mind. She had to uncover the truth, whatever it was, before it consumed her entirely. Dr. Evelyn Carter spent the next day restless, the events of the previous night haunting her thoughts. The shadow's ember eyes, the whispers, the message scrawled on the wall. "Evelyn, leave." It all felt like a warning, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. The abandoned wing held answers, and she needed to find them. Evelyn Carter spent the next day restless, and she needed to find them. By evening, Evelyn returned to the hospital clutching a small bag of supplies, a stronger flashlight, a portable recorder, and a journal to document anything unusual. As she stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the restricted floor, a sense of unease settled over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The doors creaked open to reveal the same eerie hallway. This time, the air felt colder, heavier, as if the hospital itself was breathing. Evelyn's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing the same peeling walls and grimy windows. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the dust-coated floor. The nurse's station was her first stop. She sifted through the papers on the desk, hoping to find anything that could explain the wing's closure. Among the faded documents, she discovered a logbook with entries dating back decades. Most were mundane notes about patient care. But one entry stood out. Patient 237, status escalated, moved to isolation. Staff advised to avoid room 313. Evelyn frowned, flipping through the logbook for more details. There was no explanation about what had happened to patient 237 or why room 313 was to be avoided. The lack of information only deepened her resolve. She tucked the logbook into her bag and continued down the hall. The whispers began again, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves. They grew louder as Evelyn approached the room marked 313. The door was closed, its surface marred by deep scratches. Her heartbeat quickened as she reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so. Natasha sighed as she... Taking a deep breath, Evelyn pushed the door open. The flashlight illuminated a small, sterile room. Unlike the rest of the wing, this space seemed untouched by time. The walls were pristine, the bed neatly made. A metal filing cabinet stood in the corner, its drawers labeled with faded stickers. Evelyn's eyes were drawn to the bed. Something was off. The outline of a figure was faintly visible under the sheets. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but her curiosity won. Slowly, she pulled back the covers. The bed was empty. She exhaled shakily, feeling foolish, but as she stepped back, her flashlight beam landed on the cabinet. The whispers intensified, as though urging her to investigate. Evelyn approached the cabinet and opened the top drawer. Inside were dozens of patient files, each one labeled with a name and number. Her fingers brushed over the files until she found one marked Patient 237. She pulled it out and opened it. The pages were filled with detailed notes about a young woman named Abigail Myers, admitted for severe hallucinations and erratic behavior. The final entry sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. Patient claims to see shadow people watching her. Reports of staff experiencing similar phenomena. Patient vanished from room 313 without explanation. Investigation inconclusive. The room suddenly felt colder, the whispers now a cacophony. Evelyn turned around, her flashlight flickering. The bed was no longer empty. The place is emptier, she thought, then closed her eyes as if closing a dream she had never returned from. A figure sat upright, its face obscured by shadows. Evelyn froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure's head tilted slowly, its hollow eyes fixed on her. "Well, did you come back?" The voice was barely a whisper, yet it filled the room. Evelyn stumbled backward, clutching the file to her chest. The figure stood, its movements jerky, unnatural. It took a step toward her and Evelyn bolted for the door. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each step. She sprinted down the hallway, her flashlight swinging wildly. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, clawing at her as she passed. Reaching the elevator, she slammed the button repeatedly, her panic mounting. The doors opened, and she darted inside, slamming her hand on the button for the lobby. As the elevator descended, the lights flickered. The whispers seeped through the walls, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. When the doors opened, Evelyn stumbled into the lobby. The bright lights were a stark contrast to the darkness she had just escaped. She collapsed onto a bench, clutching the patient file. Her hands trembled as she opened it again, scanning the notes for anything she had missed. At the bottom of the final page was a handwritten note. "To Sylvia." Evelyn's eyes darted to the entrance of the abandoned wing. The shadows seemed darker now, denser, as though they were watching her. Evelyn's hands trembled as she leafed through the old patient files she'd taken from the abandoned nurses' station. The small conference room she had chosen as her sanctuary felt safe, at least for now. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, their pale glow a fragile barrier against the darkness of the hospital's abandoned wing. Each file was a fragment of a larger, unsettling puzzle. The patients all shared similar symptoms: vivid hallucinations, erratic behavior, and a deep, consuming paranoia. Many of the records ended abruptly, with no notes of discharge or transfer. One file, however, made her pause. The patient's name had been redacted, but a handwritten note, scrawled in the margins, caught her attention. Subject shows heightened sensitivity to external stimuli. Shadows provoke extreme distress. Evelyn's stomach churned. Shadows. The word felt like a jagged edge pressing against her thoughts. The ember-eyed figure she'd encountered in the abandoned wing lingered in her mind, its presence unnervingly vivid. A faint knock startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned toward the door, but it was ajar, and no one was there. The hallway beyond was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the building settling. Taking a steadying breath, she gathered the files and decided to return to the nurse's station. There had to be more, something she'd missed. She couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital's dark history was somehow tied to the shadow. The nurse's station was just as she'd left it, cluttered and draped in layers of dust. She sifted through the drawers, finding little of use: outdated medical tools, empty prescription bottles, and crumpled notes. But as she reached the bottom drawer, something heavy resisted her pull. With a sharp tug, she freed it, revealing a thick journal bound in cracked leather. Her hands trembled as she read the little manuscript. The notes had been folded inside the journal. The journal belonged to a Dr. Adrian Whitmore, the head physician of the wing decades ago. The first entries were unremarkable, detailing mundane hospital operations and patient routines. But as Evelyn read on, the tone shifted. The entries grew erratic, frantic, and filled with disturbing observations. The last few observations held a transference with April 14th. May 3rd. Patient 29's condition is deteriorating. They insist the shadows speak to them, telling them secrets about those around them. I've begun to hear something myself. A faint hum. Perhaps it's stress. June 7th. I'm losing time. Hours, sometimes days. The shadow. It's not just in their minds. It's real. It wants something. I can't. The final entry was smudged, the ink smeared as if by shaking hands. June 15th. The wing must be sealed. It's the only way. If anyone finds this, leave. Do not listen to them. Do not trust the shadows. Evelyn's heart raced as she closed the journal. She felt a suffocating weight settle over her, the words echoing in her mind. The whispers, the shadows, the fear. It wasn't just her. Others had experienced it too, and they'd been consumed by it. A sudden noise shattered her thoughts. It was a low groan, like metal bending under pressure. She spun around, her flashlight beam piercing the darkness beyond the station. The hallway was empty, but the sound persisted. Closer now, almost deliberate. She stepped cautiously into the corridor, her flashlight quivering in her grip. The sound led her toward the operating theater where she'd first encountered the shadow. The doors stood ajar, a faint flicker of light seeping through the gap. "Hello?" Her voice wavered, swallowed by the oppressive silence. No response. Pushing the door open, she entered. The room was eerily still, the surgical table illuminated by the struggling overhead lamp. But something had changed. The words scrawled on the walls had multiplied, covering every surface. They overlapped, chaotic and frenzied, like a desperate plea. Evelyn's breath caught as she read one of the newer messages, its letters dripping as if freshly written. "It's feeding on you." A soft shuffle drew her attention to the corner of the room. Her flashlight landed on a figure slumped against the wall. It was Dr. Whitmore, or what was left of him. His hollow eyes stared ahead, his skeletal frame draped in tattered clothing. Clutched in his hand was a scalpel, its blade dulled with age and rust. "Dr. Whitmore," Evelyn whispered, though she knew there would be no reply. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes pressing against her. Shh. The shadows along the walls began to move, twisting and writhing like living things. They pooled together, coalescing into a familiar form. The ember-eyed silhouette emerged, its gaze fixed on her. Its dark gray eyes roamed around her, and she growled bitterly within herself. Her throat yearned for the sound of the other woman's footsteps, but her screams compressed into a familiar form. The ember-eyed silhouette emerged, its grasping hand reaching for the silhouette. "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn's voice cracked, her words barely audible over the rising hum that filled the room. The shadow didn't respond. It only stepped closer, its movements fluid and deliberate. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding her. They spoke her name over and over like a chant. "A shadow just walked past my gate." Evelyn stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. Her mind raced. The journal, Whitmore's warnings, there had to be a way to stop it. But as the shadow advanced, its ember eyes burning into her, she realized she was running out of time. Evelyn's legs felt like lead as she climbed the final flight of stairs leading to the top floor. Every step echoed ominously, a drumbeat against the silence of the hospital's darkest secrets. The weight of her flashlight was reassuring in her hand, but its beam flickered, threatening to plunge her into the abyss. Still, she pressed on, driven by the truth waiting behind the mysterious Ward Z door. The staircase ended abruptly in front of a heavy metal door. Word Z was stenciled on it in faded, rust-colored letters. Evelyn hesitated, her breath fogging in the icy air. The whispers she'd been hearing had grown louder, more distinct. Now they almost sounded like pleading voices, layered atop one another, begging her to leave, or perhaps to enter. Her trembling hand reached for the handle. It was cold, almost burning against her skin. Summoning her courage, she twisted it and pushed. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous room bathed in faint, flickering light. Rows of hospital beds lined the walls, each covered with a thin sheet. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp. Evelyn's flashlight revealed more unsettling details. Restraints hanging loosely from the bed frames, and crude symbols scratched into the walls. Her stomach churned. In the center of the room stood a lone figure, a man, or at least what was left of him, hunched over a clipboard. His lab coat was tattered, the name tag dangling by a thread. Dr. Simon Bellamy. His back was to her, and he seemed engrossed in whatever he was writing. "Dr. Bellamy?" Evelyn's voice quavered. The figure froze. Slowly, unnaturally, his head turned, followed by the rest of his body. His face was pallid, his eyes sunken and devoid of life. Yet, a faint, unsettling smile curled his lips. "You came," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves scraping against pavement. "I was starting to think you wouldn't." Evelyn took a cautious step forward. "Who are you? What happened here?" Dr. Bellamy chuckled, a hollow, eerie sound. "What happened?" He gestured to the room around them. "You're standing in the answer, Dr. Carter. Welcome to Ward Z, where nightmares were born and never left." Evelyn's grip tightened on her flashlight. "What do you mean?" "Experiences, of course." Bellamy's tone was almost cheerful. "The administration wanted results, cures, miracles. But miracles have a price, and they're rarely kind." He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "Do you feel it yet? The shadows here. They're alive. They remember." "Tayanasi." Evelyn's breath quickened. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent. She glanced around the room, her flashlight revealing faint movements in the corners, shadows that didn't belong. "You unleash something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bellamy tilted his head. "Not unleashed. Created. We opened a door we couldn't close, and now we—" He gestured to the shadows creeping closer. "Are its playthings." The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for agonizing seconds. When they returned, Bellamy was gone. In his place, the shadows writhed, taking on grotesque shapes. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart pounding. One shadow lunged toward her, its form shifting as it approached. Evelyn swung her flashlight, the beam piercing the darkness and causing the figure to recoil with a screech. But it didn't retreat for long. They were closing in. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. In the far corner, she spotted a rusted door with a glowing outline. A faint hum emanated from it, a stark contrast to the chaos around her. Without thinking, she bolted for it, dodging grasping shadows and the echoes of Bellamy's laughter. The door opened easily, revealing a spiral staircase descending into blackness. With no other choice, Evelyn descended, her flashlight barely illuminating the way. The whispers grew distant, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, circular chamber. The walls were lined with strange, pulsing veins that seemed to emit their own faint light. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it, a small black object that seemed to absorb all light around it. Evelyn hesitated, her instincts screaming to turn back, but something about the object called to her, pulling her forward. She reached out, her fingers brushing its surface. It was cold, impossibly so, and sent a jolt of energy up her arm. The whispers returned, louder than ever, but now they spoke clearly. "Take it. End this." Evelyn's hand closed around the object, and a blinding light engulfed her. The last thing she heard before losing consciousness was a single, chilling phrase. Her world was spinning as the woman moved her hand away, and the fingers lifted to point at a memory print face on the wall. "You've set us free." Evelyn's breathing echoed in the confined stairwell as she descended, the dim beam of her flashlight guiding her downward. The faint vibrations in the walls grew stronger, accompanied by a deep, rhythmic thrum like the heartbeat of the hospital itself. The air grew heavier with each step, the faint tang of iron filling her lungs. At the landing, marked Sub-Level 2, Evelyn hesitated. The door, marked with chipped red letters that read "Authorized Personnel Only," seemed more imposing than the others she'd passed. Something beyond it radiated unease. Gathering her courage, she pushed it open, the metal groaning on rusted hinges. The corridor beyond was colder than the stairwell, the chill biting through her jacket. Rows of fluorescent lights flickered sporadically overhead, casting unsettling shadows that danced on the cracked tile floor. The walls bore stains that seemed to pulse when caught in her light, as though alive. Somewhere ahead, the rhythmic thrum grew louder, interspersed with faint whispers. Evelyn followed the corridor, her flashlight revealing abandoned gurneys and overturned medical carts. She passed rooms labeled with cryptic titles: experimental therapy, containment, and isolation ward. Most doors were locked, their windows covered in grime, but one stood ajar, light spilling out in uneven pulses. Peeking inside, Evelyn's breath caught. The room contained rows of glass tanks, each filled with a murky, greenish fluid. Suspended within were human figures, or what remained of them. Limbs were misshapen, faces unrecognizable, and flesh mottled with dark patches. Some figures twitched faintly, their movements disturbingly deliberate. A clipboard hung on the nearest tank, the papers yellowed and brittle. When the last piece of paper was completed, the papers yellowed and brittle. Scanning the notes, Evelyn's stomach turned. Subject: 12. Integration. Motor function partially retained. Her hands trembled as she set the clipboard down. What had been happening here? Who had been conducting these experiments? The rhythmic thrum now seemed to emanate from within her own chest, as if the hospital itself was responding to her discovery. A sudden metallic clang shattered the silence. Evelyn spun around, flashlight darting wildly. At the end of the room, one of the tank lids had shifted, its seal broken. The figure inside, a grotesque amalgamation of human and something else, began to stir. Its eyes snapped open, glowing faintly with the same ember-like light she'd seen in the shadow. Panicking, Evelyn backed out of the room, her flashlight barely steady. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. She turned and bolted down the corridor, her footsteps echoing like gunshots. Ahead, the hallway opened into a larger space. Evelyn skidded to a halt as she entered what appeared to be a central hub. In the center of the room stood a massive cylindrical structure, its surface covered in pulsating veins of light that glowed and dimmed in time with the rhythmic thrum. Around it, computers and monitors displayed erratic lines of code and distorted images. The words Project Umbra blinked on one screen in jagged red text. Approaching cautiously, Evelyn's eyes were drawn to the base of the cylinder, where thick cables snaked outward, disappearing into the walls. A low hum resonated from within the structure, almost like a voice trying to speak. She reached out to touch the surface, only to recoil as an electric shock raced up her arm. "You shouldn't be here," a voice rasped behind her. Evelyn spun around, heart hammering. A figure emerged from the shadows, its face obscured by a hood. The voice was familiar, but distorted, as if layered with static. "Who are you?" Evelyn demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The figure stepped closer, revealing a pale, gaunt face. It was Dr. Marcus Reed, but his eyes glowed faintly, the same unnatural ember hue. His movements were stiff, almost puppet-like. "You've seen too much," Marcus said, his tone devoid of emotion. "You're interfering with the balance." "What balance? What is this place?" Evelyn pressed, desperation creeping into her voice. Sleep is inevitable. It'll find you asleep." Evelyn pressed harder. "This hospital was a sanctuary," Marcus replied, his head tilting unnaturally. "A bridge between realms, but humanity's greed turned it into a prison and then a laboratory." Before Evelyn could respond, Marcus raised a hand and the shadows in the room surged forward. They coiled around her like living smoke, cold and suffocating. She struggled, her flashlight falling to the ground and spinning, its beam casting erratic patterns on the walls. "You must leave," Marcus said, his voice overlapping with the whispers, "before it consumes you." With a burst of adrenaline, Evelyn broke free, grabbing her flashlight and shining it directly at Marcus. The light seemed to disrupt the shadows, causing them to writhe and retreat. Marcus let out an inhuman shriek, his form flickering like a dying hologram. "Exit." Seizing the opportunity, Evelyn ran back toward the stairwell. The whispers chased her, louder and more insistent. She reached the door and threw it open, the stairs spiraling upward like a promise of escape. As she ascended, the rhythmic thrum grew fainter, but the whispers clung to her mind, their words now forming a coherent warning. As she further ascended, the whispers became present, and the thrums less faint again. The secrets beneath will always rise. Evelyn burst through the door to the main floor, collapsing against the wall. The normalcy of the hospital lobby felt surreal, its fluorescent lights and distant hum of activity a stark contrast to the horrors below. But as she caught her breath, she realized something was wrong. The people in the lobby moved strangely, their heads turning to follow her with synchronized precision. Their eyes glowed, faintly, ember-like. The hospital's secrets weren't just beneath. They were everywhere. Evelyn's breathing steadied as the glow of dawn broke over the hospital. She had barely made it out of the wing alive, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The events of the night had etched themselves into her mind. The shadows, the whispers, the unearthly glow in the operating theater. She'd thought stepping outside would bring relief, but the weight of what she'd seen lingered. She returned home, her hands trembling as she brewed a strong cup of coffee. The journal sat on her kitchen table, daring her to open it. Finally, she gave in, flipping through its pages. Each entry was written in the same jagged handwriting, recounting horrific experiences of patients and staff in the hospital's abandoned wing. The final pages detailed a ritual, one meant to bind the shadows and seal their power. "Feed on fear and despair," she read aloud, "but their hold can be broken. The light, it's the key." Her pulse quickened. Could it really be that simple? If the journal was to be believed, she needed to return to the wing and perform the ritual. But the thought of facing the shadows again sent a shiver down her spine. By nightfall, Evelyn stood at the hospital's entrance, armed with a powerful flashlight, candles, and the journal. She'd memorized the ritual's steps, each etched into her mind like a mantra. Her heart raced as she rode the elevator to the wing, the oppressive silence greeting her once more. The doors opened with a groan, and she stepped out. The air was heavier, colder, as if the shadows themselves were aware of her presence. Evelyn forced herself forward, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. She reached the nurse's station, now eerily quiet. The photograph she'd pocketed earlier stared back at her, the faces almost mocking her. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, clutching the journal. She entered the operating theater, where the whispers began anew, louder and more insistent. The walls were covered in fresh scrawls of crimson writing, their messages more desperate than before. "Leave now. It's too late. You'll never escape." Ignoring them, Evelyn set up the candles in a circle around the operating table. She opened the journal to the ritual page, her hands shaking as she read the incantation aloud. The shadows seemed to writhe in response, their forms coalescing along the edges of the room. Their ember eyes glowed brighter, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. "You don't belong here," the voice growled, deeper and more menacing than the others. Evelyn's voice faltered, but she pressed on, pouring salt in a circle around her. The flashlight flickered, threatening to plunge her into darkness. She fought the rising panic, focusing on the journal's instructions. "By the light of hope I banish thee. By the strength of the living I sever thy ties," she chanted. The shadows recoiled, their forms distorting. The ember eyes blinked out one by one, replaced by a cacophony of anguished screams. Evelyn poured the last of the circle, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes," the ghost whispered after a moment. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness. Her flashlight died, leaving her vulnerable. But instead of terror, a strange calm washed over her. She reached for her phone, using its screen to light the journal. She read the final line of the incantation. "Why would the dominants try to kill us all the way into the dark of the planet itself?" Her faith flashed back to Earth, and she read the final line of the incantation. "By the dawn's first light, be gone." A blinding flash erupted from her phone, filling the room with an intense, purifying light. The shadows writhed and shrieked, their forms unraveling like smoke caught in a gale. Evelyn shielded her eyes as the light consumed the darkness, leaving the room eerily silent. When she opened her eyes, the operating theater was empty. The whispers were gone, the walls scrubbed clean of their crimson warnings. She stepped out into the hallway, the oppressive air now lifted. For the first time, the wing felt normal. Evelyn made her way to the elevator, her steps lighter. As the doors closed behind her, she glanced at her reflection in the mirrored walls. Her face was pale but resolute, her eyes filled with determination. The shadows were gone, or so she thought. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps as she descended the staircase. Each step echoed ominously, reverberating through the suffocating silence of the hospital's hidden depths. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to press inward, coated in dampness that seeped into her skin. The flashlight flickered in her trembling hand, casting jagged shadows that danced with malicious intent. At the base of the stairs, a heavy iron door loomed, rusted and ominous. A faint, rhythmic thudding emanated from beyond it, like the slow beat of a heart. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers hovering over the handle. The whispers that had haunted her since entering the wing grew louder, hissing warnings and unintelligible pleas. "Turn back," they seemed to urge, but she couldn't. Not now. Slower. Gripping the handle, Evelyn pulled with all her strength. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous room bathed in an eerie red glow. Machines of indeterminate purpose lined the walls, their surfaces slick with grime and rust. A gurney stood in the center of the room, its restraints frayed and stained dark. Above it, a single pulsating red light hung, casting the room in sinister hues. Evelyn pulled. Her stomach churned as she stepped inside, the metallic scent of blood and decay filling her nostrils. Scattered across the floor were medical instruments, scalpels, syringes, and tools she couldn't name, their edges gleaming wickedly in the crimson light. Among them lay scraps of paper, each scrawled with jagged handwriting. Evelyn crouched to pick one up. "The truth is buried," it read. "Dig deeper." A sudden sound made her whirl around. A faint scraping, like nails dragged across metal, echoed from the shadows. Evelyn's flashlight darted toward the source, revealing a figure slumped against the far wall. Her heart lurched as she recognized the tattered lab coat and hollow eyes of Dr. Matthias. Her heart lurched as she recognized the tattered lab coat and hollow eyes of Dr. Matthias. "Dr. Matthias?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He lifted his head slowly, his face gaunt and pallid, his lips parted but no sound emerged. Instead, he raised a trembling hand and pointed toward a hatch in the floor at the room's center. Only when it was clear that the hatch could be moved did he hurry away and pointed toward a hatch in the corner. "Beneath," he rasped, the word barely audible. "It's beneath." Before Evelyn could respond, the shadows seemed to surge forward, enveloping Dr. Matthias in their inky depths. His anguished scream pierced the air, and then he was gone, leaving only the faint outline of his presence imprinted on the wall. Tears stung Evelyn's eyes, but she forced herself to move, her gaze fixed on the hatch, its edges corroded and stained. As she approached, the whispers intensified, rising to a deafening crescendo. Her hands trembled as she grasped the handle, pulling it open to reveal a dark, gaping void. The ladder descended into the abyss, its rungs slick and cold. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn climbed down, the walls closing in as the air grew thicker and more oppressive. When her feet touched solid ground, she found herself in a narrow tunnel, its walls carved from raw stone. The red light from above barely penetrated the darkness, leaving her reliant on her flickering flashlight. The tunnel stretched endlessly, its silence broken only by the sound of her footsteps. But as she ventured deeper, the walls began to change. Symbols and drawings, etched with precision, covered the stone. They depicted grotesque figures and twisted forms, their eyes hollow and accusing. They screamed and moaned as the tunnel slowly melted into their dimensions. Raw. At the tunnel's end lay another room, smaller and more confined. In its center stood a pedestal, atop which rested an object draped in cloth. Evelyn hesitated, the whispers now a cacophony of fear and fury. Her instincts screamed to turn back, but curiosity drove her forward. She reached out, pulling the cloth away. Beneath it lay a journal, its leather cover cracked and aged. Opening it, she found pages filled with dense handwriting, diagrams and notes. The words spoke of experiments, forbidden rituals, and a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between life and death. The shadow thrives on despair, one entry read. It feeds on the lost, the broken. We sought to control it, but it's unstoppable. A cold hand brushed against her shoulder. Evelyn froze, the journal slipping from her grasp. She turned slowly, her flashlight illuminating the grotesque figure that loomed over her. Its form was ever shifting, its ember eyes burning with malevolent intent. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. The creature's presence was suffocating, its shadow enveloping the room. Evelyn backed away, her mind racing for an escape. "Lao, are you here?" The creature's voice boomed, resonating within her very being. "You seek the truth, but the truth will destroy you." "What are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely audible. "Hell, I am what remains," it replied. "The consequence of their arrogance, their greed. And now you will join them. Exit." The shadows surged forward, enveloping Evelyn. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the darkness as the world around her dissolved. After a moment, Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital's main wing glaring down at her. She was lying on a stretcher, nurses and doctors bustling around her. "Dr. Carter, you're safe now," one of them said, his voice calm but concerned. "Safe." The word felt hollow. As she sat up, her gaze drifted toward the elevator at the end of the hall. Its doors were ajar, revealing only darkness within, and in that darkness, faintly glowing, were two ember eyes watching her. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps as she staggered through the halls of the hospital's haunted wing. The whispers of the shadow creatures seemed louder, more oppressive, each one cutting through her thoughts like jagged glass. Her flashlight was nearly dead, its beam faltering and dim, offering little comfort in the suffocating darkness. Ahead, the faint glimmer of moonlight filtered through a shattered window, illuminating a worn map of the hospital taped to the wall. Evelyn approached it with trembling hands, scanning the layout. The power grid room, her only hope of restoring the light, was on the far side of the wing. It felt miles away. "You've come too far to turn back now," she muttered to herself, her voice a brittle thread in the silence. Gathering her resolve, she moved forward. Every step felt like an eternity, her footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floors. The shadows writhed along the walls, coiling and stretching unnaturally as though taunting her. Their ember-like eyes glowed faintly, watching, waiting. The guttural voice whispered from the void, distinct and clear. She spun around, her flashlight beam slicing through the dark, but there was nothing there. The air felt heavier, suffused with an unnatural chill that seeped into her bones. Clutching the flashlight tighter, she quickened her pace, her determination fueled by the gnawing fear that time was running out. When she reached the power grid room, the door creaked open with a groan that echoed down the hallway. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of mildew and rust. Rows of outdated machinery loomed in the darkness, their surfaces slick with grime. In the center of the room stood the main breaker panel, its switches coated in years of dust. How? Evelyn approached it cautiously, her hands trembling. Her mind raced with doubts. Would restoring the power drive the shadows away, or would it make things worse? She shook her head. She had no choice. As she reached for the main switch, a sharp, searing pain shot through her arm. She cried out, pulling back to see a shadowy tendril wrapped around her wrist, its texture cold and slick. The shadow creature emerged from the corner, its ember eyes burning with malice. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice a haunting blend of countless whispers. Gritting her teeth, Evelyn swung the flashlight at the tendril. The weak beam struck the creature, and it recoiled with a guttural screech, retreating momentarily into the darkness. Wasting no time, she slammed her hand against the main switch. The room was flooded with light. The hum of electricity surged through the air, and the fluorescent bulbs in the hallway flickered to life. The shadows writhed and shrieked, their forms dissolving like smoke in the wind. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving as she watched the creatures disintegrate, one by one. For a moment, silence reigned. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by the sterile brightness of the hospital lights. But as Evelyn rose to her feet, a gnawing unease crept over her. The shadows were gone, but the hospital didn't feel right. It was too still, too quiet. As she made her way back to the main lobby, Evelyn's footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound sharp and hollow. The once familiar halls seemed foreign, their walls stretching unnaturally as if the building itself had changed. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding. When she reached the lobby, the sight before her stopped her dead in her tracks. The space was bathed in a sickly yellow light, and the walls were covered in the same crimson scrawls she'd seen in the operating theater. "Help me! It's watching!" And there, written across the far wall in bold, jagged letters, "Instead, you'll never leave." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She turned toward the exit doors, her only thought to escape, but they were gone. In their place was a solid wall, the surface smooth and unbroken. Panic surged through her veins as she pounded on it, her fists aching with every strike. "No!" she screamed, her voice echoing back at her. "This isn't real. It can't be." A low chuckle resonated through the lobby, the sound coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Evelyn spun around, her eyes darting frantically. The shadows began to return, coalescing in the center of the room, forming a massive, grotesque figure with eyes like blazing coals. "You thought the light could save you," it said, its voice a rumble that shook the walls. "This place is ours, and so are you." Evelyn backed away, her mind racing. She refused to give in, refused to let the shadows claim her. Her hand brushed against the photograph she'd taken from the nurse's station, and an idea sparked. She pulled it out, staring at the smiling faces of the hospital staff. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "This place doesn't belong to you. It belongs to them." The shadow recoiled, its form flickering. Evelyn closed her eyes, focusing on the image of the staff, on the memories of what the hospital once was. She spoke aloud, her voice firm and resolute. This hospital was a place of healing, of hope. You have no power here. The shadow let out a deafening roar, its form disintegrating as the light in the lobby grew brighter and brighter. Evelyn shielded her eyes as the brilliance consumed everything. When she opened them again, she was standing outside the hospital. The sun was rising, its golden rays washing over the building. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Evelyn turned back to the hospital, its facade cracked and weathered, but no longer menacing. She clutched the photograph tightly, a tear sliding down her cheek. The shadows had been banished, but their scars would remain. On the hospital and on her. Taking a deep breath, she walked away, the weight of the experience settling heavily on her shoulders. The hospital stood silent behind her, its secrets buried once more. But as Evelyn disappeared into the morning light, a faint whisper drifted from the broken windows. "We'll be waiting." The end.